Welcome back to the Finance Forum. I'm Abdu-Raof Hanslo. In the hot seat, as promised, one is Mohammed Patel from NBI Risk Advisory Services, and we speaking medical cover, medical insurance, medical assurance, medical insurance. So all the various medical covers that's available to us. And just before the break, we touched on exactly options available to members. I think, Mohammed, now is a very good time to start looking at exactly what these medical aids are all about. So, of late, we've seen that there's been a problem, and this has been all over the media, that there's been a problem with the government employees medical scheme and what the financial problems are. It's cloak and dagger at the moment, but as a specialist in this field, you would probably know a little bit more than what we know. So my first question is, the issues with commonly known GEMS at present, what are the issues, and are solutions being put in place to overcome these issues?
I think, Abdu-Raof, it's a generalized issue, and claims issues, cost issues, cost pressures on all medical schemes are across the board. In terms of the GEMS scenario, I think GEMS has done themselves in a big way, because over the last 10 years that they've been running, they've had a very open underwriting protocol. So effectively, they've taken members on with very little underwriting. And as a prudent business or as a prudent scheme, you've got to apply underwriting to mitigate risk to the general mass of the scheme. So when you're accepting membership, you've got to have some sort of risk tool to try and mitigate large costs that may impact the scheme. But over the last 10 years, GEMS has not been that rigorous about it. Where open schemes, if you take an open scheme, and Abdu-Raof or myself, we join a scheme today, if we've got a medical issue, that scheme may apply a 3-month general waiting period with a concurrent 12-month waiting, condition-specific waiting period. In terms of the GEMS environment, those requirements have not come into play. So members may go on board, they may go on board with lots of medical issues, and they get taken on without any underwriting. So that's fine for the member who needs that cover and has a medical issue. He's now covered immediately. Unfortunately, for the 10,000 members who are sitting on the scheme, who are healthy and who are paying their premiums without claiming anything, that now puts an additional stress on the system as a whole. So GEMS has faced that for a while. What's effectively happened is their solvency ratios have come down, they've come under pressure, their operating reserves or their operating margins have also come under pressure, and effectively that spiral has been building and that pressure has been building for a long time. It seems like it's coming to a head right now. Obviously, what schemes then have to do is schemes then start putting measures into place, and those measures being underwriting, bringing on new members, underwriting them, applying certain underwriting criteria, a 12-month or a 3-month general waiting period. They may underwrite or apply those waiting periods. So those are the only real measures that schemes have in play that can protect the scheme. Obviously, when schemes are under pressure in that nature, what starts happening is a slowdown in terms of payments, or payment, the lag time between submission of claims and payments of claims. From what I've heard, and I'm not a member of GEMS, we do not deal with GEMS, let me put that out there, but what we've heard from members is that it does seem to be that lag time between a claim being instituted by the service provider and the time where the date when that claim gets paid. So that seems to be stretching out a little bit. So perhaps it's a measure that GEMS is using as a cash flow measure to try and mitigate against any risk. However, let me put it out there, a scheme as large as GEMS, and the government being the source or the trustees on the GEMS board is majority made up by government members and government employees. I don't think at this point in time we're going to see GEMS fall down because it's that large. So the government will have to put something into place to try and protect the scheme. The scheme at this point in time is putting the measures of waiting periods and the like. But I think it's a little bit late to be applying that, because you've got a mass of maybe sickly people already on board. They've just got to be more stringent now in terms of how they look after the scheme.
I think another case of SAA and ESCOM, basically a supporting structure of the government, that, as our Minister of Finance pointed out from the podium one day, about a month ago, where he said that the supporting structures of the government, the structures that are supported by the government, will never fail, because the Treasury will basically bail them out. So here obviously we see a problem. But I think going further into that, is it a mismanagement in the sense that the correct way of managing this medical scheme has not been put in place? And I mean, with the medical aid that size, probably one of the bigger plans in the country at the moment, being that the government employs the most people in the country. So yeah, I think, you know, over the last while, over the last 2 to 3 years, or even longer, we've seen many of the medical aid schemes amalgamate. We've seen Prosano and Bonitas of late. I think that was the last one we saw, where the two came together. And Prosano being a well-known brand, also quite a big membership, and then amalgamating with Bonitas, another big brand, also with a big name. That seems like the order of the day at the moment. And is that something that we're going forward? I mean, specifically speaking about GEMS, we have no hopes of GEMS obviously amalgamating with any other medical aid scheme as they're government run. But the other medical aid schemes, the ones where you and I have the option to join, are we going to see more amalgamations of these schemes going forward?
Abdu-Raof, certainly, I think that is the future. And the issue around the Prosano and Bonitas is actually, it's an old story, because that's been superseded by Liberty Medical Scheme, amalgamating into Bonitas now. So that's been the latest of the casualties that has fallen in terms of the open scheme environment being Liberty.
So in that case, basically, we've seen 3 schemes basically become one.
Scheme over the last 2.5 to 3 years, effectively. Yeah. In terms of the government or the GEMS scheme, I think GEMS, and just going back to it, I think the issue around, it's not around a mismanagement, but I think it was an issue around the ultimate objective of the scheme. And the ultimate objective was to cover as many government employees as possible. And specifically a segment of the government market or government employees who it was unaffordable. So from a subsidy perspective, the government made it very attractive for the lower segment of the employees to be on a private medical scheme, which effectively took the pressure off the state system, and the rationale and the motivation was right. In the execution, I think they had a couple of missteps in the execution. In terms of amalgamation in the open environment, I think that's going to be the order of the day. I think we're probably sitting with about 40 open schemes at this point in time. And on a yearly basis, we've been seeing schemes amalgamating. There's been a couple over the last 2 years. And I mean, the ones we mentioned now, that's just been the highest of the casualties. But there have been a lot of smaller ones which have amalgamated. And at the end of the day, the Council of Medical Schemes, their mandate is to look after the industry as a whole, as a regulator, and obviously to protect the consumer. So it's not in their interest that schemes fail. So before a scheme fails, they'd rather marry 2 schemes up and protect the membership, the reserves, and those members stay within the framework, and then they don't fall out of it. So the amalgamation is definitely something we're going to see. With some of the larger schemes, we're seeing them snapping up the smaller schemes, and the smaller schemes, just by virtue, or the larger schemes by virtue of economies of scale, are able to then provide benefits which are perhaps better or perhaps more efficient in terms of provision of services. And that also begs the question, what is the motivation behind all the parties? We've got 3 parties in the relationship. You've got a medical scheme, you've got a consumer, and then you've got providers, and each one has their own motivation within the framework. So the medical schemes, their motivation is to provide cover within an acceptable framework of cost. That is the motivation of schemes. And when they fall outside of those parameters, that's when the ball starts getting rocked, or that's when they start looking at maybe amalgamating. And unfortunately, schemes are not able to deny cover to members. Open schemes are not able to deny members. So effectively, that has an impact on your risk profile. You can't stop people coming on board. If they want to come on board, there's nothing that stops it. It's community underwriting, so everybody effectively cross-subsidizes each other.
I think I think we have about 3 or 4 minutes left, but I think before we go anywhere else, I think we need to look at one specific piece of legislation that's been tabled a few years back already, and that is something very similar to the National Health Insurance Scheme in the United Kingdom.
That's correct.
Whereby I call it the Nationalised Health Services Scheme in South Africa. You have a different name for it. You call it universal healthcare.
Yeah, that's correct.
This proposed piece of legislation, now we're seeing this government employees medical aid scheme in trouble. If this does come into effect, and we don't know when ultimately this is going to be passed and the structures put in place in order to facilitate this, but if this comes in, certainly this will take a lot of pressure off a medical aid scheme like GEMS. Am I correct in saying that? And then also the pros and the cons. What are the pros and the cons when looking at the nationalised health insurance scheme?
I think, Abdu-Raof, the starting point behind NHI is provision of healthcare to all in the country. So that's the starting point, that's the auspices under which NHI has come into fruition. The government's stated ambition is to provide healthcare, provide quality healthcare across the board from the bottom end to the top end. And as such, if NHI comes into effect, and that's a massive if, because it's a very costly exercise, and the government's got a lot of challenges on their plate, specifically with trying to curb their budget at this point in time, with our credit agencies watching us very carefully. So that's a very careful situation, very precarious position they're in. But NHI needs to cover everybody. So effectively what would happen is, it would be tier 1 in terms of medical coverage. Private medical coverage would be a tier 2. So members would not be able to opt out of NHI. All members would have to buy into the scheme, right? Via a tax of sort for those that are working, and other mechanisms for the rest. But effectively that would be tier 1. In terms of private schemes, GEMS, if NHI comes into effect, would probably at some point in time cease to exist, because all members would be covered by NHI, so all South Africans would be covered by NHI. Private medical aids may still stay in effect, and what you'd have, and you have this model in countries like Germany, where you have private medical coverage as well as the state system, and that type of hybrid approach would still stay. But my problem is that it's still too expensive. It's a very expensive system. We don't have the systems in place. We don't have the capacity in terms of the services, doctors, hospital, and the like. And it's a long way off.
I think we need to enter into a separate discussion when looking at NHI and the nationalised health insurance that may be offered by government, because I think that's a topic on its own. And I think, Mohammed, if you don't mind, we're going to invite you back to put you in the hot seat and chat to you about that.
That'd be my pleasure.
You've been watching the Finance Forum with myself, Abdu-Raof Hanslo, and my guest, Mohammed Patel from NBI Risk Advisory Services, and we've been speaking about medical aids. I hope you've benefited from the comments from our special guest today, and we encourage you to stay focused to your finances.